This is What Does It Profit? And I'm your host, Dr. Dawn Carpenter. In this show, we talk about value, the social and moral value of business. Each episode, each guest will bring me a little closer to finding out, what does it profit? Last week, we talked to Reuters corporate governance reporter Jessica DiNapoli. For those who speak Italian, you must have cringed because I botched it. I said Di Napoli versus DiNapoli. Well, just like season 1 with Chiara versus Chiara, or Chiara, or however I said it, I butchered it, from the Mama Agata cooking school on the Amalfi Coast. You know, it's Lent, I confess, I botched up their beautiful names. This week on What Does It Profit, we're going to get the name right, because this time I'm putting it on you. We're going to talk with a man whose name is well known in the investor relation offices of many of the most well-known corporations in America. I like to call him the dean of the Shareholder Rights Movement. Others like to call him a corporate gadfly. In our conversation, you decide, corporate gadfly or inside progenitor of the next generation of capitalism. Let's talk with shareholder activist James McRitchie. And now let's welcome to What Does It Profit, James McRitchie. Hey, Jim, how are you?
I'm doing great. Great to be here, Don.
Well, thanks for coming. We've got so much to talk about. I think our biggest challenge is going to be just kind of honing in on what's on my mind today, which is this idea of the future of the corporation and how the shareholder governance paradigm changes that are happening nowadays are building into what that might look like. But I have to start in a place of name calling. You have been called probably many things over the years, but the one that captures my imagination and is this idea of a corporate gadfly.
Well, of course, a gadfly, Plato referred to Aristotle as a gadfly. And so, that's a nice connection to have because Aristotle was not a powerful person, a philosopher who went around asking tough questions. And so that's where the term originated. In terms of corporate governance, the Gilbert brothers are kind of the penultimate gadflies. And Lewis Gilbert attended his first meeting in 1932 in the Depression. And he felt he was dissed by the CEO because the CEO would not answer his questions. But they fought for things like auditor reports, destaggering boards, proxy access was his biggest thing. And then there was Wilma Soss as another person. She fought for women on corporate boards. And she fought against the practice of crediting millions of unmarked votes. If you left your proposal blank or your proxy blank, it would go to management. And I fought that still today, recently.
That's the thing. I think there are these names in history that for the broader general public aren't familiar. We don't learn about these names in textbooks, and we only get to hear about them through others. And you've been doing this work for a really long time. Tell our listeners a little bit about how you get to this place, your origin story. I guess whenever anybody asks me that question, it's like, well, where do you want to start? I want to start where you came from. Tell us a little bit about your family and kind of what made you you.
Well, my parents came from the old country, Canada, to the United States. And,
we all have an immigrant story somewhere.
Yeah, right. That's our old country. So they came down to the States. I was born here. One of my brothers was born in Canada. He still lives there. And I grew up in Mount Lebanon. And at that point, a long time ago, Pittsburgh was the third largest corporate city in the country. And so I had people on my paper route who were CEOs of U.S. Steel and Alcoa and Westinghouse. My father was a professor, so I thought of him as poor, and he was poor in comparison to these other folks.
Yeah, I guess it's all really relative. My dad owned a bar, so we all come.
I heard.
Yeah, we all come from somewhere. And so here it is, you're a kid, you have a paper route, you're in the middle of this environment, a very wealthy community, influential community, and you're growing up. And you head off to school. And what were you thinking you were going to study?
I studied economics initially because I thought that the world was very unfair because here these rich people that lived around me, they were earning 20, 30 times what the average person earned. And I thought, wow, they were very much disconnected with reality. So I studied economics so I could try to bring the rest of us up or bring them down a notch, whatever, even the playing field. But then I found out that economics was built on a very faulty foundation of everyone acting like an automaton, as far as everyone maximizing their own profits, their own toys.
Yeah, I'm sensing you had deep inside this idea that that's not the way that the world really is.
Right, right. I mean, my parents, they grew up in Saskatchewan. I think Canada is a little bit more of a caring country than the United States. If you look at the wealth disparity between the two countries, it's not anywhere near as great as the United States, but it's still much smaller than you would find in many European countries or Japan or other places.
So I see that heading you to like something like sociology, right?
Right. I then ended up with sociology eventually on my second graduate degree. And I studied at a school where I got a grant from the National Institute for Mental Health to study what is the best corporate form. But at the same time, the best corporate form for mental health for the workers and for society and productivity and all that. And so I had professors that I was very interested in that topic. But also, Peter Berger happened to come to the university at the same time. And my favorite book was The Social Construction of Knowledge, I guess it was, by Peter Berger.
Yeah, it's a classic. I mean, it's got, this
The Social Construction of
of
Reality.
knowledge, I think it's what it,
Okay, but
if I'm remembering correctly. Listeners, you go look that up.
I think
Google's the
maybe
source of
reality.
everything. And no, they are not a sponsor of the show.
Yeah.
Um, and so here you've got these influential ideas in your mind. And my recollection of that book is that institutions in society are created by people and they're there to serve people, and thereby they're changeable and they should evolve.
Yeah, exactly. Because I think that we tend to reify the conceptions that we have. We've actually even made corporations into people. So they have the standing of people in court, but yet they are not an actual tangible object that you can touch and whatever. They are a figment of our imagination, but that we all agree to.
So that, of course, sends you to California, right?
Well, I'd already lived in California for many years.
Okay, so let's get to that part of the story. I just jumped you from graduate school to coming out to California to do co-op.
I mean, basically, I dropped out of my PhD program to go help workers at Wrath who bought out their company. Then I got thrown out of Wrath after, anyway, that's a whole story. But I tried to help them. And then I went back to California and headed the California Cooperative Development Program.
So you are doing some work in the cooperative development area in California at the
Right.
earlier stage in your career.
Yeah, California had a cooperative development program, and I headed that. And I was able to even work with the legislature to save the cooperative development program when the governor wanted to cut it. And I got the votes necessary to keep the program alive, but the governor cut the budget to zero. So I had to leave that.
Well,
And
that's,
at the same time,
yeah, I was going to say that's the thing. I mean, right? The money is a huge lever in what happens in the world. And so you spent a stint in the regulatory world. How did you end up in that space, and what kind of lasting impact do you think that had on your work?
well, about that time, I had friends who died of what we called chemical hypersensitivity. But chemical hypersensitivity, there's no one anything. Like I've got what a normal doctor might diagnose as restricted airwaves disease. And other people had AIDS, and other people had hepatitis C, although AIDS came along later, but hepatitis, or another friend he lost his immune system. He worked for a pharmaceutical company. Anyway, I had friends dying of losing their immunity. And so I got legislation passed through again through the California legislature, but it was vetoed by the CMAs, the Chemical Manufacturers Association. You can well imagine them wanting to veto on something like that, but also the California Medical Association, because they didn't really know how to diagnose these problems. And to get thousands of patients all of a sudden, that would be problematic for them. So they said that this was all in our head. Anyway, then I went to work for Cali, PA, tried to regulate chemicals.
And Jim,
Found out
around what time was this? Situate us
about
on.
1984.
Okay, so mid 80s.
Yeah. And I found out there that I could only regulate, even though our department within Cali, PA, which is the largest component, was called Toxic Substances Control. I couldn't actually regulate toxic substances. I could only regulate hazardous waste. In Europe, they have a precautionary principle. You can't bring a chemical on without proving that it's okay. Whereas in the United States, we kind of work in reverse. So
Right. So here you are. I'm hearing some frustration as a regulator wanting to do things, and then you told me once about this, meeting that maybe was your epiphany. I don't know if you'd describe it that way, but that's the way I heard it. That kind of got you to a place where you realize maybe there's a more effective way to capture the attention of these chemical companies.
yeah, I mean, before that, I ran for the CalPERS board. I tried to get CalPERS to start a corporate governance unit. So I was very much aware that corporations have enormous impact on the world. And that was the lever as a shareholder. Also, this epiphany moment actually was being over at the Capitol, writing a bill with Dow Chemical and all the oil, Western States Petroleum and Chevron and all those folks. And they each of those attorneys, they would have like 5 bills, and there'd be one public interest attorney right out of college who had a 500 bill load and couldn't possibly understand the ins and outs of the legislation that we were writing.
All right. So all of this is going on in the 80s. Let's fast forward. You created what we think of as the first corporate governance blog on the internet. Tell our listeners about it.
Well, I actually started that in order to try to get the job at CalPERS. I started that in 1995, and I used to go jogging with the chief counsel. And I wanted to show him, hey, I know something about this topic. And so I put up a website on corporate governance. It was the only website. I didn't get the job, but I got invitations to speak at Hong Kong corporate secretaries and in Korea and Japan and London and lots of other places because people thought, well, this guy's got a blog on corporate governance, he must know something. So it worked out okay. And then I started filing proposals and we moved on from there.
Okay, so that's a bit about how you got to where you are. Let's talk about what you are doing now. You have been very involved with the proxy access process. And this is something that our listeners probably are not at all really familiar with. And if you were to describe it in a very simplistic way, explain what a proxy is and explain its function in corporate governance.
Well, your proxy is like your ballot. You vote by ballot for people in the legislature or the president or whatever. So if you're a shareholder, you vote on your proxy for the people that you want to represent you in the company. And those people are a board of directors, and they oversee the CEO, they oversee the management of the company. If you want to challenge the board, if you want different people on the board, then normally you have to go out and basically pay for another proxy.
So that's a
And you have
very
to send that.
yeah. So that's an expensive process. So an individual really is stymied if a retail individual investor wants to engage with a company that he or she owns. They really rely on institutional investors to act on their behalf. And what I'm hearing is that your work is trying to democratize that process.
Yeah, so proxy access, anyone can many people can file shareholder proposals, but not very many people can challenge a company's board, pay for a whole solicitation. So the idea was to have your candidates listed on the corporation's proxy, so you wouldn't have to pay for a separate solicitation effort. And the condition was that you could only do that for a limited number of candidates. You couldn't be trying to take over the company, you couldn't be trying to change it all around and kick out, but you would have influence on the company. Actually, for most of history, we had proxy access. And then all at once, the SEC decided, they reinterpreted a rule at a point and decided that there was no proxy access. And that's when we started. Like, I petitioned the SEC in 2002 to bring proxy access back. Someone challenged in 2006, there was a court case that threw out the SEC's decision that denied proxy access. Anyway, it gets very complicated.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's the whole point of it, right? The process is complicated. The process is expensive. The process is opaque. And these are the impediments, if you will, for any hope of real democratized process. But what I'm hearing is that the bulk of what you do really could be understood as creating the infrastructure, the technical tools that are available to shareholders who then can use them in advocacy or maybe even on the other side of the equation in ways that might be more aggressive, kind of in line with what we would have imagined, the traditional corporate raiders back in the 80s. I don't know if this is a character that would come to mind for you, but think of the Ivan Boesky, Greed is Good, and the 1980s film Wall Street and all of that. The work that you're doing makes that kind of activity possible, but it also makes other types of activity possible. Am I understanding you?
Right. That was the impetus. I think I forget who it was now, but one of those folks, Carl Icahn, somebody, green-mailed Texaco, and that was the impetus for starting the Council of Institutional Investors. So CalPERS, CalSTRS, a bunch of other in New York got together and formed the Council of Institutional Investors. And they fought things like greenmail, where a corporate raider would go after a company and say, I'm going to try to take over your board. That's going to cost you a fortune to fight me off. Just pay me $100,000 and I'll go away, or $1 million, whatever it was.
So greenmail versus blackmail, we make money and we'll go away.
Right. So they didn't like that. And so they formed this organization. And so then public pension funds started taking a much more active role in corporate governance. And so there's kind of two sides of the coin. There's corporate governance, which deals with what I believe are the laws, the rules of how the game is played. And then there's people that deal with what I kind of see as the symptoms, which are back then were the SRI funds.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there. Our listeners probably need a little bit of vocabulary help. So SRIs, socially responsible investments, and then we haven't mentioned the other one, which we talk about a fair amount here on our show, ESG, environmental, social, and governance. So you're playing in the G space, right?
Yes.
And then the SRIs, if I'm understanding correctly, are playing in the E and the S space, by and large.
Right. And they switched over actually from SRI to ESG.
Yes. So it's a little bit of they're coming into your ecosystem and you're melting into theirs.
That's right.
Do you think that will be more of the norm?
Yeah, because we live more and more, we live in an intangible economy. So it's corporations like Facebook, Google, Amazon that are based on the internet, that are not bricks and mortar type. Those organizations are driving the economy. And intangible factors like the environment, and social are more intangible than your typical bricks and mortar type structure. We're seeing more and more patents and software, all those kinds of things are the real economy now, not the bricks and mortar stuff so much.
What I'm hearing is that these SRI funds back in the day, I think of some like Pax World, I think they may have been the first. They started moving things in a social justice perspective. You've been working on the rules of the road. You come together and now you all find yourself facing another narrative. You have in 2019, the Business Roundtable proclaiming a new paradigm of corporate governance, this idea of stakeholder governance. What's your take on that? We started that episode by reflecting on the fact that JP Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon was at the helm of the Business Roundtable at that announcement. And just recently, his board has said, we're not ready to become a benefit corporation, which might be yet one solution towards getting there. So we'll just have to keep watching this unfold.
Yeah, I've got several proposals to try to convert those companies that signed into public benefit companies, and nobody's embraced it. So.
Well, you've always been, in my view, a little bit ahead of your time. So we'll let that one continue to simmer. Well, I'm very interested in how you view the dynamic. I mean, you're a shareholder. That's how you get entry to the conversation. So you actually have an ownership interest in the company. It sits in your portfolio, but you have a small position. And there have been some changes at the SEC that have upped the requirement for the size of the position, perhaps in response to some of the, I guess I'd categorize some of them as real successes in moving the needle in governance. What's your view?
Yeah, that's definitely true. I mean, basically, boards of directors do not like being told what to do, and neither do CEOs, even if it's good advice. Although I would say that more are coming around to, if you can offer them good advice and they see that it's in their good, they are accepting it more. But at the same time, the Business Roundtable was coming out with that statement about stakeholderism. They were fighting at the SEC to raise these limits that you just talked about. So instead of $2,000 worth of a company, you have to own $25,000 worth of a company in order to file the shareholder proposal. Well, most Americans don't own any stock. And those that do own stock usually own in the form of mutual funds. So they're not voting their stock.
So you become the voice of the little guy, I guess.
So
No, really, but in my mind, it becomes more of a conversation not of shareholder against corporation. It's more maybe really shareholder against shareholders.
that's a little off. It's a poll tax basically to get to have a voice. But BlackRock, Vanguard, Fidelity, those huge funds, it's not shareholders versus shareholders. They don't necessarily want me to file lots of proposals, but they want me to have that right to file proposals. And actually, probably 50% of the proposals I file, they vote for. So, I usually get majority votes on about half of my proposals. And BlackRock and Vanguard, they welcome those. But of course, they can't introduce those proposals themselves because that would alienate their customer.
Exactly. Well, that's where I was going. It's kind of the elephant in the room. Let's just call it what I think it is, the conflict of interest, where you have these large funds who want to provide asset management solutions for these companies, but yet they also provide this function to investors. So they're really on both sides of the table. So it makes, I would think, it very challenging for them to take on the kind of, I don't know, parental role, if you will, that maybe you're in a position to take.
Yes, they're between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah, I've heard that expression before. Well, let's talk about a little bit of legacy. So you've had some wins. What are some of the proposals that you're proud of?
Well, I guess my wins have been mostly in corporate governance.
Well, that's what I
So
mean. So let's talk
yeah,
about
yeah. So we've declassified most of the boards in the S&P 500.
Jim. I'm going to stop you there. Explain to our listeners what it means to declassify a board and why that is important, and then maybe why that might have an unintended consequence.
Declassifying boards is instead of electing a board member once every 3 years, you elect that board member every year. That makes them more accountable. So you can make sure that they're doing their job every year, although it's very hard to monitor corporate directors. But it also means the unintended consequence is that the corporation is more subject to hedge funds and corporate raiders taking them over because they don't have to do that over a period of 2 years. They can try to replace the board in 1 year.
Yeah, so I can see why that might be problematic for people who work in that space within corporations, but I don't get the sense that was your intention.
No, and there's lots of other things like that I work on, and I'm playing the long game. And the long game, one example of the long game is engine number one and CalSTRS have now gone after Exxon, and they've gone after them to try to not replace the entire board, but to get 4 members on the board and to move Exxon in the direction of green energy instead of fossil fuels, because Exxon, and it's very good for CalSTRS and other share owners, but you can take a look at Exxon stock. It's just dropping like a rock compared to solar and other things that are still rising.
Yeah, so I could see why the folks at Exxon aren't maybe so happy, but maybe in the long run, it really is doing them a favor.
Of course, of course, but they don't look at the long run because the average CEO is probably there for 3 years or whatever. So they're not looking at the long run.
Well, I mean, that's the thing, right? You could substitute Exxon for any number of other companies who are in these challenging spots where people come together as shareholders and say, hey, we think that in the long run, our business would be better if we focused in these kinds of areas.
Right. And that's where people like, or CalPERS, those public pension funds, they're investing for 30 years. And as an individual, I'm investing for 30 years. Basically, I don't sell the stock unless it's Carnival Cruise or something and we're in a pandemic. Well, then I will definitely sell. But basically, I'm a buy and hold person because I'm not using those shares in order to live.
Yeah. But there are people who do. And so that's this give and
But
take. But
even when they do, most people are investing in the long term. They're investing in their 401k, 457, whatever. They're investing for their retirement. And so that is a long-term investment generally. And if you're investing and you're day trading, you're not going to do very well usually.
No, just revisit our conversation on what does it profit about Robinhood and GameStop. We dealt with some of those issues there, but I can't let you leave the show without asking you the quintessential what does it profit question. I know this always gets to everyone because really what I'm trying to do is kind of probe inner motivation, which is the work that you're doing in trying to reform the shareholder rights process, those tools that shareholders have to effectuate change in companies. When it's done for the good, what does it profit?
Well, I think limited liability made corporations probably the most dynamic investment tool ever created by people. But it also allows companies to profit by externalities like creating drug addicts, promoting lies through the internet, and actually have changed our elections and have all kinds of bad consequences. And so what it profits by doing this work is setting up guardrails. And government can't do this by itself because government is too often controlled by business. So we need to work down several different paths at the same time in order to create a more inclusive economy and reconnect our values, reconnect ourselves with nature, and if you're a religious person, with God.
Yeah. I guess it's an old adage, right? What you see depends upon where you sit. And where you sit, Jim McRitchie, is right in the heart of some really important technical inner plumbings of our corporate governance systems. And I won't go anywhere else with that plumbing analogy, just to say that we are very grateful that you shared some of these insights, because without having continual conversation about them, I think people have a hard time understanding motivation. So, Jim, I'm very glad that you have been a long time doing this work. You come from a long tradition of people who have been in the movement, if you will. So I thank you for joining us on What Does It Profit?
Well, and I'm very excited to be on your program. I think you've had some great guests.
Now you're included. We'll put you in the guest gallery.
Thank you.
You've been listening to What Does It Profit? Thanks to those who've gotten the word out about the show. This week, I want to draw your attention to the podcast Uncertain Things, the show where Adam and Vanessa, two self-described jaded journos, talk about what's wrong in the world, or in my case, maybe what could be right. This week, I'm talking to Uncertain Things about my ethics work and the belief that we all have a meaningful role to play in life. And we all have a moral responsibility to ask ourselves from time to time, what does it profit? Check out Uncertain Things wherever you listen to podcasts. In our next episode, we're going to another universe. On What Does It Profit, we're only in season 2, so we're not quite ready to go to Mars just yet, but we're going full-on superhero with a man who believes there's a superhero in each of us.
When anybody that I meet or anybody that I know or can think of, they are great at something. And maybe they discovered it or maybe they haven't yet. But I do think that there is something inside of everybody that makes them excel beyond their peers. Every time you say to somebody, wow, I don't know how you did that. To me, that alone kind of says to them that you're amazing at something. I really believe that exists inside of everybody.
Next on What Does It Profit? And in the world of all things superhero, the founder and former chairman and CEO of Wizard Entertainment and the co-founder and CEO of Ace Comic-Con, Gareb Shamus. Until next time, follow us on social media to keep up with the show and to help us build the What Does It Profit community. We're hanging out mostly on LinkedIn and Twitter at the moment. And please don't forget to subscribe and tell your friends about the show. You can meet our team and sign up for our weekly newsletter on our website, whatdoesitprofitpodcast.com. What Does It Profit is written and hosted by me, Dr. Dawn Carpenter. This episode was produced by Lucy Wang. Executive producer is Jordan Gaspore. Special thanks to our talented interns, Niels, Hannah, and Sean. Other team members and our long and illustrious group of friends and supporters can be found at whatdoesitprofitpodcast.com. Before I let you go, let me remind you to never stop asking yourself, what does it profit?